Here is the ultimate paradox of war. A pilot climbs into the cockpit of the enemy's most feared machine, the very weapon that helped destroy his homeland. Yet he does so not at gunpoint, but by choice. This is the untold story of Hans von Lersner, a German pilot whose deliberate defection and subsequent cooperation with the U.S. military became a high-stakes intelligence operation, kept secret by the Pentagon for over 3 decades. To understand the sheer audacity of this arrangement, we must first dive into the grim reality of the Third Reich in December 1944. Germany was not merely losing the war. It was in a state of terminal, agonizing collapse. The desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, was sputtering towards spectacular failure, consuming the last of Hitler's fuel and manpower reserves. German cities were being systematically reduced to ash and rubble by the Allied strategic bombing campaign, a constant, terrifying reminder that the Luftwaffe, once the unchallenged terror of Europe's skies, had been broken. In the midst of this disaster, there was a vanishingly small group of men who still held the shattered pieces of the German Air Force together. These were the true professional aviators, the veterans and the aces who had been fighting since the invasion of Poland in 1939 and possessed a mastery of flight, honed by years of combat and high-level testing. Hans von Lersner was not just one of these men. He was one of their most valuable assets. Born in 1914, Lersner joined the fledgling Luftwaffe in the early 1930s, rising quickly through the ranks based purely on his technical aptitude and precise flying skill. By 1944, he had cemented his reputation, not as a combat ace with hundreds of kills, though he had his share, but as Germany's foremost test pilot. His true value lay not in fighting the current war, but in building the future one. He was one of the few men alive who had flown and evaluated the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, which represented Germany's last, desperate hope for air superiority. Lersner understood the revolutionary performance characteristics of the jet, its strengths, its flaws, and the precise tactics required to maximize its killing potential. He held in his head the keys to Germany's most protected technological secrets. It is this critical context that makes his actions on a cold December 14, 1944 so extraordinary. Lersner was not flying an aggressive sortie over the front lines. He was conducting a routine but vital test mission in a Messerschmitt Bf-109, the aging but resilient backbone of the German fighter force since the Spanish Civil War. His task was mundane but essential, evaluating critical modifications to the aircraft, performing the technical work that kept Germany's dwindling air fleet marginally operational amidst parts shortages and constant Allied bombing raids. Then disaster struck. Official records from the time merely state engine failure. By late 1944, this was a common occurrence. The German war machine was running on scraps. Forced laborers in factories often engaged in subtle sabotage, and engineers were forced to substitute high-quality materials with inferior, hastily produced Ersatzmetals, particularly in critical engine components. A failing engine was as much a political reality as it was a mechanical defect. Lersner's particular flight involved testing a new fuel mixture system, a sign of the increasing strain on Germany's petroleum reserves and industrial quality. The breakdown was likely catastrophic and sudden, leaving no time for complex emergency procedures. Lersner, a pilot of supreme skill, found himself gliding silently over a winter landscape with a 1,500-horsepower engine turned into a dead weight. The dilemma he faced in those desperate, silent seconds was the first critical fork in his life's path. He could have attempted to feather the propeller and glide back to German lines, risking an emergency belly landing on a crowded, bomb-damaged airfield. He could have bailed out over territory still controlled by the Wehrmacht. He could have attempted a crash landing in a remote, friendly field, risking injury but securing his return to the Reich. Any of these options were the expected, loyal, professional course of action. They were also the course of action that guaranteed his continued participation in a lost, bloody, and increasingly criminal war. Instead, he chose to glide toward the American sector, behind enemy lines. Why this decision? Lersner's later, carefully worded explanation focused on minimizing civilian casualties, claiming he was concerned about attempting an emergency landing near a German town or city. While this may have been partially true, the deeper, far more practical reason was one of survival and professional self-preservation. Lersner knew that the Americans, unlike the Soviets who were closing in from the east, were signatories to the Geneva Convention. As a high-value captured pilot, he would be treated with a minimum degree of professional respect. He saw the chaos and inevitable brutality of the final fight within Germany's borders. A jump to the west offered immediate security, an end to the terrifying cycle of flying and fighting, and a chance to survive the war whole. The choice was between a slow ideological death and a pragmatic professional surrender. When the American forces reached the snow-dusted crash site, likely near a small village in the Ardennes or Alsace region, they found an extraordinary sight. A nearly intact German test aircraft, its engine cowling peeled back to expose the mechanical failure, and sitting calmly in the cockpit, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilots, waiting for their arrival. Lersner had surrendered himself, and, more importantly, a trove of invaluable, classified knowledge. Standard protocol would have required a quick interrogation, followed by shipping the pilot off to a prisoner of war camp in the American heartland. But when the intelligence officers realized who they had captured, a man who had routinely flown the Me-262 jet fighter and the cutting-edge developments of the Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt firms, the routine immediately ceased. They hadn't captured a mere fighter jockey. They had captured the physical embodiment of German aviation's technological future. The game had just changed. Lersner's war and his life was about to take an unprecedented, classified turn that would challenge every notion of wartime loyalty. The capture of Hans von Lersner on December 14, 1944, immediately threw American intelligence protocols into disarray. Standard procedure for a downed enemy pilot involved a quick series of interrogations to glean tactical information, unit movements, morale, immediate flight plans, before they were whisked away to a prisoner of war, POW camp in the American interior. Lersner's case, however, was anything but standard. This was not a demoralized, recently conscripted teenager. This was a man who held the most sensitive, cutting-edge aviation secrets of the Third Reich. His fate, and arguably the future of American aviation, was swiftly placed in the hands of Lieutenant Colonel Harold Watson. Watson was no ordinary intelligence officer. He was a consummate professional aviator in his own right, one of America's most experienced test pilots, tasked with a highly classified ongoing mission at Wright Field, Ohio. Since 1943, Watson had been the lead American engineer attempting to evaluate captured German aircraft, reverse engineering Messerschmitts, Dorniers, and Focke-Wulfs to understand the enemy's technological edge. He had meticulously studied the aircraft, but there was a crucial, intangible element missing: the perspective of the man who had truly mastered them. When Watson first sat across from the captured German pilot, the encounter instantly transcended the typical captor-prisoner dynamic. Watson recognized in Lersner not just an enemy combatant, but a technical peer. This initial interrogation, which should have been a 72-hour formality, became a marathon session that stretched for 21 days. Watson later described these sessions as the most fascinating conversations of his military career. Lersner, sensing that he was dealing with a professional and not a political zealot, began to speak with a surprising degree of candor. He didn't offer easily compromised tactical secrets. Those were fleeting and low value. Instead, Lersner offered high-level technical insight. He understood the war was lost, and his professional pride demanded that he discuss aviation on an objective level, even with the enemy. He could explain why German engineers made the design compromises they did, the trade-offs between speed and range in the Focke-Wulf FW-190, the structural flaws inherent in the early production models of the Me-262 jet, and the specific, doctrinal thinking behind the Luftwaffe's shift toward high-altitude, short-range interception tactics. He described the persistent, maddening problems caused by the material shortages, the ersatz metals, the low-quality fuel, and the increasingly desperate reliance on forced labor that plagued the German production line. This wasn't just intelligence, it was a comprehensive masterclass in the strategic weaknesses of the German war machine, delivered by a man who had lived them. The sheer depth of Lersner's knowledge convinced Watson that simply shipping him off to a conventional POW camp would be a profound, unforgivable waste of invaluable intelligence. The German pilot held the key to understanding the Me-262, the jet that represented the greatest technological threat to Allied air superiority. Watson knew that the only man who could accurately articulate the full potential of that jet, and how best to defeat it, was the man sitting in his office. It was during one of these intense late-night sessions that Watson conceived an idea that was, by the standards of wartime security, unthinkable. What if we let him evaluate our planes? The reaction from Watson's immediate superiors was exactly as anticipated. An immediate, emphatic, absolutely not. The security implications were monumental. American aircraft designs were heavily classified, allowing an enemy pilot, a man who had sworn an oath to the Führer just weeks earlier, to gain intimate knowledge of U.S. aviation technology would violate every single security protocol, risking years of technological advantage. The decision involved issues of treason, national security, and potential espionage. But Watson, driven by the professional conviction that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to gain an asymmetric advantage, persisted. His argument was simple. Lersner could spot flaws and strengths in American aircraft that American pilots, accustomed to their own designs, simply couldn't see. It was the ultimate, objective second opinion. The debate was escalated, winding its way through the highest levels of the Army Air Forces command, moving ultimately to the Pentagon. For over 3 weeks, the fate of Hans von Lersner hung in a tense, bureaucratic limbo, debated by generals and intelligence chiefs who had to weigh the enormous, tangible risk against the potential for an equally massive, war-ending gain. The intelligence officers who supported Watson argued that the war was entering its final, most critical phase. They argued that the sheer volume of Allied production was already known to the Germans, but that they lacked the crucial knowledge of Allied tactical strengths and design weaknesses. Lersner could provide that missing piece. Furthermore, if they could unlock the true potential and limitations of their own aircraft through Lersner's experienced enemy eyes, they could better prepare for future conflicts. A clear, chilling acknowledgement that the Cold War was already dawning. The decision was, therefore, not just about winning the current war, but about securing the peace that would follow. The sheer weight of Lersner's professional value, coupled with Watson's persistent advocacy, eventually tipped the scales. The risk was deemed high, but the potential intelligence reward was deemed higher. After 23 days of tense debate, the decision came down from Washington, bypassing countless protocols and overriding the deepest security fears. The proposal was authorized. The military machine had chosen pragmatism over procedure. The classified memo that authorized this secret component of Operation Lusty, the Allied effort to loot enemy technology, landed on Watson's desk in February 1945. The bizarre partnership was set to begin, but under a set of extreme, extraordinary conditions designed to mitigate the colossal security risk. Lersner, the professional soldier, was about to be asked to betray his country by flying its enemy's most powerful weapons. The decision from Washington to allow Hans von Lersner to fly American aircraft was unprecedented. It was a radical gamble that shattered decades of military security protocol, codified in a single classified memo that authorized the most sensitive component of Operation Lusty, the U.S. effort to exploit captured enemy technology. Lersner's journey from a prison interrogation room to the cockpit of an American fighter was fraught with extraordinary conditions, both imposed by the Pentagon and demanded by the German pilot himself. The Pentagon's ironclad terms. The U.S. military command, while recognizing Lersner's value, was terrified of the security risks he presented. Therefore, the authorization came with a rigid, non-negotiable set of safeguards designed to maintain the fiction of his capture, while extracting maximum intelligence. These conditions were designed to fence him in, both physically and technologically. Legal status as POW. Lersner would remain legally and officially a prisoner of war. This was crucial for legal and diplomatic cover, ensuring he could not be officially recognized as a defector or a cooperating expert, a detail that protected the U.S. from accusations of coercion or espionage. However, his living conditions were elevated. He was housed in comfortable private quarters at Wright Field, Ohio, a secret testing facility, rather than the harsh confines of a standard POW camp. The military command knew a professional of his caliber would not cooperate willingly if treated with the standard brutality of a wartime prison. Strictly limited access. He would be granted access only to aircraft types that the German military had already encountered in combat. This was the core security firewall. No experimental, prototype, or truly secret designs were to be shown to him. The intelligence gain had to come from his enemy perspective on known aircraft, not from exposure to America's future technology. They wanted insight into the P-51 Mustang's strengths, not the blueprints for the next generation of American jets. Armed. Constant surveillance. Every single flight and nearly all ground activities were to be monitored by armed guards. Furthermore, the aircraft he flew would be subtly modified to prevent any desperate attempt at escape. This could involve limiting fuel capacity, restricting certain technical functions, or disabling communication systems. Anything to ensure that if Lersner suddenly banked toward the Atlantic, he wouldn't get far. The risks of this experiment were clearly visible in the armed soldiers who shadowed Lersner's every move. The voluntary clause. The most important condition was a matter of psychology and law. Lersner had to agree voluntarily. There could be no coercion, no overt threats of punishment, and no explicit promises of freedom or citizenship. If he refused, he would immediately be relegated to a remote, high-security POW camp, just like any other captive. The American gamble was based entirely on the assumption that Lersner's professional curiosity and desire for survival would outweigh his national loyalty. The professional's quandary. When Lieutenant Colonel Harold Watson presented this proposition to Lersner, the German pilot was confronted with an intense moral and professional quandary. For nearly 10 minutes, Lersner sat in absolute silence. He had been a loyal soldier in the Wehrmacht, though increasingly disillusioned with the Nazi Party's politics, sworn to an oath. He was now being asked to actively, professionally assist the enemy who was dismantling his nation piece by industrial piece. His inner conflict was devastating. The professional aviator in him saw the offer as an irresistible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the chance to step away from the collapsing chaos of the Reich, and more importantly, to fly the legendary machines he had only seen as distant targets. The opportunity to analyze the P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the P-38 Lightning from the inside was a dream for any pilot of his caliber. He viewed the American invitation not as a political betrayal, but as a chance to practice his high-level profession without the constant interference of Hitler's disastrous strategic decisions or the lack of quality materials. The pragmatic realist in him also understood that the war was lost. Continuing to fight was suicide. Cooperation was the clearest, most comfortable path to survival, and crucially, to the continuation of his career. He saw a future where his skills would be wasted, either rotting in a prison camp or struggling in a destroyed country. This offer was a clean exit, a chance to maintain his identity as an elite aviator. Lersner's demands, a declaration of professionalism. Finally, Lersner broke the silence, not with gratitude or surrender, but with firm, professional demands of his own. These conditions offered a profound glimpse into his character, separating him from the fanatic and positioning him as a technical professional seeking self-preservation. No direct combat mission. Lersner emphatically refused to fly any mission that could directly or indirectly harm German forces. This was his ethical red line. He would test, evaluate, and advise, but he would not participate in any operational planning or fly near the front lines. He would betray his country, but he would not directly kill his former comrades. This distinction allowed him to justify his actions as scientific collaboration rather than military treason. Honest and professional evaluation. He insisted that his flight evaluations and technical reports must be taken as honest, unbiased, professional critiques. He was not interested in telling the Americans what they wanted to hear. He demanded the right to function as a genuine, objective test pilot. This demand underscored his identity as a scientist of flight, placing his profession above politics. He wanted his observations to be treated as legitimate data, not propaganda fodder. A new life. Lersner requested that when the war finally ended, the U.S. government must actively assist him in immigrating to the United States. He knew that once he cooperated, there was no returning to the shattered, vengeful post-war Germany. His cooperation was his bid for a new career and a new life in the nation that had proven its industrial and technical superiority. After another round of intense internal debate, particularly over the sensitive issue of post-war immigration assistance, the U.S. command again decided the reward was worth the risk. The impossible partnership was formally agreed upon. The logistics team at Wright Field immediately began preparing aircraft for the ultimate test, scrutiny by the former enemy. The stage was set for March 1945 when Hans von Lersner, the German ace, would walk out onto the tarmac to meet the plane that had helped defeat his Air Force, the legendary P-51 Mustang. He was a prisoner, but in that moment, he became a strategic asset more valuable than any piece of captured technology. The day was March 15, 1945. The location, Wright Field, Ohio, the secretive heart of American flight testing. The main test runway lay before the German pilot, and parked on the tarmac was the target of his professional scrutiny. The North American P-51D Mustang. For Hans von Lersner, walking across the concrete toward that aircraft was an intensely surreal moment. The Mustang, with its distinctive laminar flow wing and powerful Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, was more than just a superb fighter. It was the symbol of the Luftwaffe's defeat. It was the long-range escort that had accompanied American bombers deep into the Reich, the blue-nosed bastard that had shot down countless of his comrades and shattered the German air defense system. Lersner's entire career had been dedicated to designing and piloting aircraft to defeat this very machine. Now he was about to climb into its cockpit as a cooperating prisoner of war. The irony was not lost on the American test pilots and armed guards watching the scene. But for Lersner, the experience was immediately one of pure professional revelation. As he inspected the aircraft up close, his expert eye immediately settled on details that German high command had willfully ignored. The superiority of logistics. Lersner was immediately struck by the American ground crews. By early 1945, German maintenance was a chaotic mess, plagued by parts shortages, rushed repairs, and exhausted, often undertrained personnel. Here at Wright Field, Lersner saw professionalism and abundance. The equipment was clean, the tools were meticulously maintained, and the crews worked with a relaxed confidence born of near-limitless supply. The efficiency and sheer volume of high-quality logistics, The ability to keep the aircraft flying impressed him as much as the aircraft itself. He noted the difference between American standardization and the desperate improvisation that characterized German airfields by the end of the war. This was the first, silent piece of intelligence he relayed. The enemy was not just technologically advanced, but industrially insurmountable. Climbing into the cockpit, Lersner felt the difference in quality of production. His German aircraft, though perhaps more complex and aggressively designed in certain aspects, were often finished crudely due to desperation and material substitution. The Mustang, in contrast, felt robust, consistent, and built to last. It was a machine clearly designed not just for high performance, but for mass production and maintainability. The two elements Germany had fatally failed to grasp. Lersner felt a sense of vindication in this discovery. He was a pilot, not a politician, and the evidence of superior engineering and organization was undeniable. Lersner's assessment. His first flight in the P-51 lasted just over 2 hours, closely monitored from the ground and followed by an American chase plane. He executed high G-turns, tested its limits at altitude, and simulated various combat maneuvers. When Lersner finally taxied back and climbed out, the American test pilots, led by Lieutenant Colonel Watson, immediately gathered, desperate for the assessment of a true expert. Lersner's response was characteristically direct and damning to his former employers. "Your engineers have solved problems we didn't even know we had." He praised the power and reliability of the Merlin engine at high altitude, noting that German engines consistently suffered from power loss above 25,000 feet due to quality issues. He was particularly impressed by the Mustang's range and ergonomic design, pointing out that German fighters were built for short-burst interception over the home front. Lersner explained that this fundamental design difference meant American pilots could stay and fight deep in German territory, while the Luftwaffe pilots were constantly forced to disengage and return to base, a crucial factor in the war of attrition they were losing. But his most significant observation, the one that resonated throughout the Pentagon's aviation command, was simple. You don't just build better aircraft, you build aircraft better. He was pointing to the sheer consistency, quality control, and industrial reliability, the bedrock of the American industrial miracle that the Nazi command had dismissed as propaganda. Lersner provided irrefutable, first-hand proof that Germany had been defeated not by superior genius, but by superior logistics and industrial consistency. American test pilots began to appreciate their own aircraft's strengths, its longevity and reliability, in ways they never had when compared to the flashier but fragile German jets. The classified bombshell, intentional defection. Lersner spent the following weeks testing virtually every frontline American fighter: the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt, the distinctive twin-boomed P-38 Lightning, and even early, sensitive versions of the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star jet fighter. Each flight yielded volumes of tactical and technical intelligence, filling gaps in the American understanding of their own strengths and vulnerabilities. Yet, there was one piece of information that the U.S. government kept classified for decades. Information so sensitive that it fundamentally alters the entire context of Lersner's capture. In 1978, when declassified Luftwaffe maintenance records were finally cross-referenced with the initial American intelligence reports, the truth was revealed. Lersner's engine failure on December 14, 1944, was not an accident. Evidence strongly suggested that Hans von Lersner had deliberately sabotaged his own aircraft's engine components before the test flight. This was not a forced landing resulting in capture. It was a calculated defection. The high-value information he possessed was not just the reason for his specialized treatment. It was his currency for freedom. This bombshell revelation changes everything. Lersner's composed demeanor, his immediate willingness to cooperate with Watson, and his firm demands for a new life in the U.S. were not the reactions of a reluctant prisoner. They were the actions of a professional who had executed a meticulous, high-stakes escape plan. He hadn't landed behind enemy lines because he was forced. He had landed there because he chose to. His deliberate act was the ultimate rejection of a dying, ideological state. The official American files from the time suggest that key intelligence officers, perhaps even Watson himself, suspected the defection from day one. The Pentagon buried the truth because revealing that a German ace was voluntarily betraying the Reich would have been an immense propaganda victory. But it would have risked the entire Operation Lusty and jeopardized Lersner's cooperation. The lie that he was a captured pilot forced to help was maintained to protect the partnership. Lersner was not a simple POW. He was a political refugee and a technical asset of the highest order. He had consciously rejected the Nazi regime and its self-destructive ideology, choosing the clean, objective world of professional aviation over the fanaticism of a collapsing military machine. His service with the Americans was, therefore, his payment for freedom and the continuation of his cherished profession. The Germans thought they had lost a plane. The Americans had gained a genius. And the intelligence he would continue to provide would not only help win the current war, but would lay the foundation for American air dominance in the future Cold War conflicts to come. Following the definitive revelation that Hans von Lersner's arrival was a meticulously planned defection and not a mere capture, the dynamic at Wright Field, Ohio, fundamentally shifted. He was no longer a prisoner of war under interrogation. He was a highly prized, co-opted asset. Lersner's test flights continued, each one meticulously recorded, providing the U.S. military with invaluable intelligence that went far beyond mere technical specifications, exposing the Luftwaffe's fatal flaws. Lersner's greatest contribution was his chillingly objective analysis of the German Luftwaffe's strategic and doctrinal failure when confronted by American air power. Having spent weeks flying the very aircraft he had tried to shoot down, his insights were devastatingly clear, providing the American High Command with a level of insight that tactical victories alone could never achieve. The endurance factor. While Lersner conceded that some German fighters, like the Focke-Wulf FW-190, might have possessed superior rate of climb or roll rate for short bursts of combat, he explained that the entire German doctrine was built around short-range interception over home territory. This meant their aircraft possessed limited fuel capacity. Conversely, American fighters like the P-51 Mustang were built for endurance, designed to escort bombers for 1,000-mile round trips. Lersner explained that this fundamental design difference meant American pilots could stay and fight deep over the Reich, while German pilots were constantly forced to break off combat and return to base, ultimately surrendering the skies by default. He called this the psychology of retreat, noting how demoralizing it was for pilots to watch an enemy remain aggressive long after they themselves had to worry about fuel gauges. The illusion of quality. Lersner's critique of German industrial consistency was particularly painful. He told the Americans that the quality of German aviation fuel, lubricants, and engine components, particularly by late 1944, was catastrophically inconsistent. This undermined the performance figures of even their most advanced designs. He provided technical details that helped the Americans understand that German planes were not operating at their theoretical best, confirming that the massive Allied bombing campaign targeting the Reich's industrial base had been far more effective than previously calculated. German engineering might have been brilliant on paper, but Lersner showed how the lack of quality control turned potential superiority into fragile mediocrity in the field. The Me-262. Weakness. Lersner, the premier test pilot for the jet, detailed the jet's Achilles heel, its engine reliability and its vulnerability during the slow approach and landing phases. This information was crucial for developing the precise tactics needed to shoot down the revolutionary German jet and maintain Allied air superiority. He explained that the jet's revolutionary speed was often negated by the need to fly predictable, low-speed patterns during landing, making them easy targets for waiting Allied fighters, a critical piece of intelligence that saved countless bomber crews in the final months of the war. The bond of professionalism. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the operation was the genuine professional respect that blossomed between Lersner and Lieutenant Colonel Harold Watson. Watson had been prepared to deal with a fanatic, but instead found a man whose highest allegiance was to the science of flight. Watson later wrote extensively about their unusual relationship, comparing it to two medical professionals discussing a difficult operation, oblivious to the fact that they worked for opposing hospitals. They spent hours discussing the abstract philosophy of flight testing, the future of aviation technology, and the universal challenges of airframe design, subjects that transcended national boundaries. The American pilots at Wright Field, who initially viewed Lersner with deep suspicion, slowly developed a grudging respect. They saw his meticulous attention to detail, his lack of ideological posturing, and the sheer value of his observations. For his part, Lersner found the Americans to be neither the soft, undisciplined soldiers of Nazi propaganda nor ruthless ideologues, but consummate, well-equipped professionals. The common ground of the cockpit proved stronger than the political division of the battlefield. This psychological phenomenon, where professional bonds override wartime enmity, was one of the unexpected yet most valuable pieces of data gathered by the operation. The arrival of peace and the new threat. The uneasy stability of their partnership was abruptly fractured on May 8, 1945, with the official surrender of Germany. The war in Europe was over. Lersner's status immediately became impossibly complicated. He was no longer a military prisoner of an active enemy, but he was far from free. He was a foreign national who held top-secret intelligence and had technically betrayed his country. Germany was occupied, and its aviation industry was non-existent. He was a man without a country, yet with unparalleled value. Crucially, however, the U.S. military realized that Lersner's value had not decreased, it had increased. The moment the fighting stopped in Europe, the shadow of the Soviet Union loomed large. American military planners immediately pivoted their focus from defeating the Nazis to preparing for the inevitable Cold War. Lersner, as a German air veteran, had extensive experience flying against the Soviet Air Force on the Eastern Front. He understood Soviet aviation doctrine, knew their key aircraft, such as the Yakovlev and Lavochkin fighters, and could offer insights into Eastern European aviation development, intelligence that was now desperately needed. He was a ready-made expert for the emerging geopolitical conflict. The Americans understood that if they let Lersner go, his expertise would either fall into Soviet hands or be lost entirely. The American High Command realized that sending Lersner away would mean losing a strategic asset with unique expertise relevant to the new global conflict. His proven integrity and technical skill, validated over months of flying American hardware, made him irreplaceable. The temporary wartime expedient of allowing an enemy pilot to fly U.S. aircraft was about to transition into a long-term, peacetime commitment, a professional partnership with a former foe that would shock the world if it were ever made public. With the war over, the tension at Wright Field, Ohio, shifted from the battlefield to the bureaucratic. Hans von Lersner's status as a co-opted German asset had to be formalized. The U.S. military command, convinced of his strategic value, decided not to discard him. They realized they needed a bridge to the future of aviation, one that understood both German innovation and the rising Soviet threat. The ultimate offer: a new life. In December 1945, exactly 1 year after his deliberate defection, the Americans presented Lersner with an offer that fulfilled the last of his conditions and secured their future intelligence needs. A permanent position as a civilian test pilot with the U.S. Air Force. This decision was not made without significant internal controversy. Many American pilots and staff questioned the ethics of awarding a high-security, sensitive position to a former enemy pilot. They argued that it set a dangerous precedent and insulted the sacrifices made by American servicemen. But Lieutenant Colonel Harold Watson and the intelligence chiefs who worked closely with Lersner argued fiercely for his retention, citing his unique skills and proven integrity. Watson's assessment was a powerful testament to the bond of professional respect. This man has technical skills we cannot replicate, and more than that, he has proven his loyalty to the science of flight over the fanaticism of a dying regime. We would be fools to send him away. Lersner accepted immediately. He spent the next 5 years working directly for the U.S. military, primarily testing captured German aircraft as part of Operation Lusty and providing invaluable insights into American designs. His evaluations were incorporated into training programs that prepared American pilots for the fast, jet-powered challenges that would soon erupt over Korea. His technical intelligence about high-speed flight and aerodynamic principles gleaned from the Me 262 significantly influenced the development of early American jet fighters. He helped American engineers understand the precise airflow dynamics required for efficient supersonic flight, years before the public knew such technology was possible. The classified blueprint, Operation Paperclip. But the biggest bombshell, the information the Pentagon successfully buried for 33 years until the 1978 declassifications, was that the Lersner program was not an isolated incident. It was the blueprint for a much larger, politically explosive operation. Lersner was the successful test case for Operation Paperclip. While Operation Paperclip is famously associated with Wernher von Braun and the Rocketry Division, the vast secret program also involved recruiting hundreds of German aviation specialists, engineers, and scientists. Lersner's smooth, high-value transition from a supposed POW to a fully co-opted, paid civilian employee demonstrated to the American government that it was possible to selectively recruit and integrate former enemy experts. The success of Lersner's professional partnership with Watson provided the strategic and ethical cover needed to justify bringing over more than 200 German aviation experts to the United States. He wasn't just part of Paperclip, he was the architectural model that proved the concept worked, paving the way for the U.S. to gain an unparalleled technical advantage over the Soviet Union. The final tally: traitor or professional? Lersner's extraordinary story compels the ultimate ethical question. Was he a traitor to Germany, or a professional doing what he thought was right? The declassified files make the answer clear. Lersner was an individual who chose professional integrity over a lost cause fueled by fanaticism. By deliberately defecting, he made a conscious choice to survive and continue his career in the service of aviation science, rejecting the political and military suicide of the Nazi regime. What Lersner gained? He gained survival, a distinguished second career with the world's leading air force, and a comfortable life in the post-war world. He continued to fly and advance the field he loved. What America gained? The U.S. gained irreplaceable technical intelligence, a deeper enemy perspective understanding of their own weapon systems, and, most importantly, the psychological and procedural model for Operation Paperclip, which secured American technological superiority throughout the early decades of the Cold War. Hans von Lersner returned to Germany in 1950 to help rebuild the nascent West German aviation industry, continuing his career as an esteemed test pilot and consultant well into the 1970s. He maintained his close friendship with Harold Watson until his death in 1997. Lersner's legacy is a powerful, complex reminder that in the heat of history's most destructive conflicts, simple narratives of good and evil often break down. The bonds of shared professional expertise and human decency can sometimes triumph over the overwhelming forces of ideology and war. His classified service with the U.S. Air Force stands as one of World War II's most improbable partnerships, demonstrating that the most valuable military assets are sometimes those who choose to cross the lines.